We thought it was just another routine drill, another frozen wasteland beneath our feet, untouched by time, undisturbed by human hands. But then, the sonar picked up something impossible, an immense structure buried deep beneath the Antarctic ice, perfectly geometric, unmistakably artificial. At first we thought it was an error, some kind of glitch in the equipment, but as we drilled deeper, the readings only became clearer. There was something massive down there. A city, preserved in ice, hidden for what must have been thousands, maybe millions of years. But we didn't just find it. We woke it up. The drilling team had been at it for days, boring through layers of ancient ice with precision. Every inch we dug revealed something stranger, a perfect grid system, immense pillars carved from stone that shouldn't have been there, and eventually something even more unsettling. Embedded in the ice were structures, actual buildings, walls, and what looked like roads, all preserved as if time had simply stopped. The deeper we went, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a natural anomaly. I was part of the research team overseeing the excavation, documenting everything we uncovered. I'd seen some strange things in my years of deep sea and polar research, but nothing like this. The formations were too symmetrical, the corridors and archways too deliberate. Someone, or something, had built this place. The base camp was buzzing with excitement. Geologists, historians and archaeologists had been flown in, all desperate to get a glimpse of what lay beneath. We set up floodlights, running power cables down into the massive cavity we had drilled open. The ice had formed a natural dome over the city, an underground cavern that seemed to stretch for miles. It was breathtaking, but as the lights flickered on, illuminating the frozen ruins, a strange unease settled over us. The air down there was heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite name. And then we saw them. Encased in ice, just beyond the first row of buildings, were figures, humanoid, hundreds of them, and they were staring at us. At first, we thought they were statues. The way they stood, frozen in perfect rows, made it seem like some kind of ancient monument. But as we got closer, that idea fell apart. Their faces weren't carved from stone. They had features, detailed, expressive, and disturbingly lifelike. Their eyes, though clouded by layers of ice, seemed too real, too aware, like they had been caught mid-motion, frozen in the middle of something. Some of them had their mouths open, as if they were trying to scream. Others had their hands raised, reaching toward something unseen, their expressions twisted in what could only be fear. A few of the scientists began debating if this was some kind of preservation technique, like the bodies found in Pompeii, victims of an ancient catastrophe. But this was different. Their postures weren't the same as those caught in volcanic ash. There was no chaos, no panic. It was orderly, deliberate, like they had been arranged this way. We set up scanners to analyze the bodies, hoping to determine how long they had been down here. That's when Dr. Kessler, one of the lead biologists, found something that made my stomach drop. "There's tissue integrity," she muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They're not desiccated. There's no decomposition." She turned to me, her face pale. "They should have decayed by now, but it's like they were frozen yesterday." The camp went dead silent. The implications were too horrifying to process. If they hadn't decayed, if their bodies were still intact after all these years, then they weren't just preserved, they might still be alive. And that's when the ice cracked. The sound of the ice splitting echoed through the cavern, a deep, groaning noise that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Every instinct in me screamed to move, to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The crack started small, a hairline fracture along the nearest ice wall where one of the figures stood. Then it spread, jagged and deliberate, like something was pushing from the inside. Dr. Kessler stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the cables at her feet. "That's impossible," she whispered. "It's too cold for thawing. It's—" The ice exploded outward. Shards shot through the air like glass, and one of the frozen figures collapsed forward, hitting the ground with a sickening, wet sound. For a moment, no one moved. The body lay there, motionless, coated in a slick layer of melting frost. I could see the details now: greyish skin, elongated limbs, and fingers that ended in something just a little too sharp to be human. Then, its chest rose. A breath. Not slow, not sluggish. A full, deep inhale, as if whatever this thing was had just woken up from a nap. Someone screamed. One of the younger researchers, Carter, bolted back toward the lift leading to the surface. The rest of us stood frozen, watching as the figure's fingers twitched against the ground, then curled, pushing itself up. It didn't move like a person. There was no confusion, no hesitation. It knew where it was. It knew we were there. And when it finally raised its head, those clouded eyes had cleared, black, glassy, and staring straight at me. Then, all at once, more cracks splintered through the ice around us. One by one, the frozen figures began to move, and we had just woken up an entire city. Panic hit the camp like a shockwave. Someone knocked over a light, plunging half the cavern into flickering darkness. The radio was alive with frantic voices, scientists screaming for evacuation, the security team demanding answers. But none of us had any. We had no idea what we had just unleashed. The figure that had fallen was standing now, its movements unnervingly smooth, not sluggish, not stiff from centuries of ice. It tilted its head, watching us, studying us. Then it opened its mouth. A sound tore through the cavern, low, guttural, and wrong. It wasn't a voice. It was something deeper, something that crawled beneath my skin and set every nerve in my body on fire. The other figures, the ones still frozen in the walls, began to respond. Their own ice cages cracked and splintered as they twitched, their bodies jerking back to life. We needed to leave. Now. "Fall back to the lift," someone shouted, but the words barely registered. I was already moving, grabbing Dr. Kessler and shoving her toward the exit. The others were running too. Scientists, workers, even the armed guards who were supposed to be protecting us. But the moment we turned, the thing moved. I didn't see it happen. 1 second it was standing there, the next it was in front of Carter. He didn't even have time to scream. One of those 2 long hands clamped over his face, fingers pressing into his skin like they were sinking into clay. Then he stopped moving. His body convulsed once, then went stiff. His mouth was still open, frozen in a silent scream, and his eyes turned black. The same glossy, empty black as the thing that had touched him. Then he exhaled. Not Carter, not anymore. Something else was breathing through his lungs. I grabbed Kessler and ran. We sprinted toward the lift, our boots slipping on the frost-covered ground. Behind us I could hear more of the ice breaking, more bodies falling forward and inhaling that first breath in what had to be thousands, maybe millions, of years. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. Kessler was sobbing, half dragging herself forward as we reached the metal platform that would take us back up to the surface. I slammed my fist against the controls, barely able to breathe. Nothing happened. The panel flickered, then died. "No, no, no, no!" I mashed the buttons again, but the entire system was down. The power cables, the same ones we'd run down here for lights, equipment, heat, were severed. The things had already cut us off. "Backup generator," Kessler gasped, her breath coming in sharp bursts. "We have a secondary power source, up near the ridge." That meant we had to climb. The cavern stretched high above us, walls of ice and stone leading up to the original borehole we had drilled. A service ladder was bolted into the rock, but it was a 40-foot vertical climb to the emergency access hatch. And we weren't alone down here. A guttural clicking sound echoed through the cavern, not speech, not exactly. But it was communication. I could feel it in my skull, vibrating behind my eyes like something was trying to get inside my head. More of them were waking up. Carter, or the thing that used to be Carter, was the closest. His limbs twitched unnaturally as he turned toward us, his blackened eyes reflecting the dim floodlights. He wasn't breathing hard like we were, wasn't exhausted, wasn't shivering. His body had adapted in seconds. And then he moved. No hesitation, no build-up, just a blur of motion as he lunged at us, faster than any human should be able to move. I barely had time to react. I grabbed one of the nearby floodlights and swung it up, smashing it into Carter's face. The bulb exploded, sparks flying as his head snapped back, but he didn't scream, didn't even flinch. He just stopped, cocked his head, then reached for me again. Kessler yanked my arm. "Go! Climb!" I turned and ran. The ladder was our only option. As we scrambled up the rungs, I dared one last glance downward. The city was awake, and they were all looking up at us. I climbed like my life depended on it, because it did. My fingers were stiff from the cold, burning with every grip on the frozen metal rungs. Kessler was right behind me, gasping, struggling, but climbing. Below us, they were moving, not just Carter, dozens of them. The ice was shattering everywhere, bodies slipping free like they had never been trapped at all. And they weren't just standing there anymore. They were coming for us. Something about the way they moved made my stomach twist. It was too smooth, too fluid. Their limbs bent a little too far, their spines arched unnaturally as they scaled the walls without effort. Kessler screamed. I looked down and saw one of them, one of the things, climbing right beneath her. It wasn't using the ladder, it was scaling the sheer ice, fingers digging into the frost like it was soft clay. And it was fast. I reached down, grabbing her wrist. "Come on, move!" She tried. God, she tried. But the cold, the fear, it was slowing her down. And the thing beneath her was almost there. I had no choice. With one hand, I yanked the emergency hammer from my belt and swung downward as hard as I could. It cracked against the creature's skull, a sharp crunch echoing through the cavern. Its head snapped to the side, but it didn't scream, didn't even react. Instead, it turned those empty black eyes up at me and smiled. A slow, deliberate, unnatural smile that sent ice straight through my veins. Then, without warning, it grabbed Kessler's ankle. She shrieked, kicking wildly, but its grip was like iron. It wasn't just trying to pull her down, it was trying to do something else. Her body went rigid. I saw her eyes roll back, saw her lips part in a silent, choked gasp. She was changing. I wasn't thinking anymore. I swung the hammer again, this time at her boot, smashing the thick sole until the leather snapped and her foot slipped free. She nearly fell, barely managing to grab the ladder again as the thing tumbled back into the darkness. But Kessler wasn't okay. She clung to the rungs, her whole body trembling. And when she looked up at me, I saw it. Her eyes weren't fully black. Not yet. But something inside them had shifted. Something had gotten in. And I didn't know how much time she had left. Kessler was gasping, her breath ragged and uneven. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing up the color in her eyes. But she was still there, still fighting. "Don't stop," I told her. "We're almost there." She nodded weakly and kept climbing. I could hear them below us, skittering, shifting, that awful clicking sound vibrating through the ice. They were learning, adjusting. Their movements were getting faster, sharper, more coordinated. They weren't just waking up. They were hunting. We reached the top of the ladder, a narrow ledge carved into the rock. A steel hatch was built into the ice, a secondary access point leading to the upper tunnels. I slammed my shoulder into it, trying to force it open, but the cold had sealed it tight. Come on," I muttered, yanking at the handle. Behind me, Kessler groaned. I don't feel right." I turned to her. She was shivering violently, but not from the cold. Her skin was clammy, her fingers twitching like something was crawling under her skin. I didn't know what to do. If we made it out, would she even be Kessler anymore? How much of her had already changed? But we didn't have time for that. A hand slapped against the ledge below us. Then another. Then another. They were here. I threw my full weight against the hatch. The metal groaned, then popped free, the frozen seal breaking apart. I grabbed Kessler and shoved her through the opening. She barely made it before they reached us. I saw their hands, long, spindly fingers stretching for my legs. One of them lunged, its face inches from mine, and I finally got a good look at it. It wasn't human, not really. The features were close, too close. But the skin was too smooth, the bones too sharp, and the eyes. The eyes were the worst part, not because they were black, not because they were empty, but because they were familiar, like they had been human once, like they still remembered. I scrambled through the hatch and slammed it shut behind me. A second later, something heavy crashed against it from the other side. The metal groaned, but held. For now. Kessler was curled up against the ice, shaking. She was getting worse. I didn't know if I had just saved her, or if I should have left her down there. I didn't want to look at her. Kessler was curled against the wall of the ice tunnel, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking like she was freezing from the inside out. I could hear her breath coming in short, uneven gasps, could see the way her fingers twitched like she was trying to keep control of them. But I'd already seen what happened to Carter. I'd seen what those things could do. She wasn't screaming in pain. She wasn't thrashing. Whatever was happening to her, it was slow, a process. And I didn't know how much of her was still her. "We need to move," I said, forcing the words out. She didn't respond at first, just sat there staring down at her hands. Then finally, she nodded. I grabbed the emergency flashlight from my belt and switched it on. The tunnel stretched out ahead of us, narrow, uneven, but stable enough. This was one of the original access shafts we'd drilled weeks ago, long before we broke through into the cavern. It led back to the main station, to the comms tower, to the last place on Earth where we had a chance of calling for help, if help was even an option anymore. Behind us, something slammed against the hatch again. The metal creaked, but it still held, for now. I turned and started moving. Kessler followed, her steps uneven. She was slowing down. "Talk to me," I said. "Tell me what's happening." Her breath hitched. "It's in my head." I stopped walking, turned to her. She was gripping her temples, her teeth clenched. Her pupils had gotten worse, no longer fully human, but not completely black yet either. "It's whispering," she gasped. I can't understand it, but it's trying to show me something." "Show you what?" Her whole body shuddered. "I don't know. I don't want to see it." A wave of nausea rolled through me. This wasn't just a disease. It wasn't an infection. They were still connected. Somehow, those things, those creatures down in the ice, they could still reach her, still get inside her mind. I had no idea how long we had before she wasn't Kessler anymore, and I didn't know if I'd be able to stop her when the time came, but we kept moving, because we had no other choice. The tunnel stretched ahead, a narrow passageway carved through solid ice. Our breath came out in ragged clouds, the flashlight casting long, jagged shadows against the walls. Every few steps, Kessler stumbled, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. I wanted to believe she was still with me. But I had seen the way Carter changed, the way those things didn't just kill. They took. I kept my grip tight on the emergency hammer. I didn't want to use it. But if I had to, no. I couldn't think like that. Not yet. We pressed forward, every step taking us closer to the main research station. If we could get there, we could send out a distress signal. We could warn the world about what was down here. But then, Kessler stopped walking. I turned. "Kessler?" She stood frozen, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Her pupils had dilated even more, the blackness spreading like ink. "It's closer," she whispered. The flashlight flickered. My chest tightened. "What do you mean? Closer?" She gripped her head, fingers digging into her scalp. "I can see it." Her voice was barely audible, trembling with something between terror and awe. "The city. It's not dead. It never was. It's waiting." I felt something shift in the air. A pressure, a weight pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. The tunnel walls seemed wrong. The ice wasn't just ice anymore. Shapes twisted just beneath the surface, shifting, writhing. like something was watching us, like something was waking up. I grabbed Kessler's arm, shaking her. "Snap out of it. We have to go." She didn't respond. Then, without warning, she turned, not toward me, toward something behind us. I followed her gaze, slowly, terrified of what I might see. At first there was nothing, just the empty tunnel stretching back into darkness. Then the shadows moved. A figure stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, just walking. I raised the flashlight. The beam flickered, sputtered, and for a split second I saw its face. Carter. Or what used to be Carter. His mouth was moving, forming words, but no sound came out. His body was wrong, limbs just a little too long, his skin stretched too tight. But his eyes, they weren't just black anymore. They were filled with something else. Something moving. Something alive. Then, from deep within the tunnel, another shape emerged. Then another, and another. One by one they stepped forward. Silent. Watching. Waiting. And behind them, deep in the darkness, something even bigger shifted. Something massive. Something that had been waiting for us all along. I couldn't move. The tunnel felt smaller, like the ice was pressing in, like the air had been sucked away. My fingers were frozen around the flashlight, but I wasn't sure I wanted to see anymore, because whatever was in front of me, whatever they had become, wasn't human. Not anymore. Carter stood closest, his mouth still forming silent words, his blackened eyes locked onto mine. The others, more of the research team, more people I had known, stood behind him, watching, waiting. And then I felt it. A presence. Not in front of me, not around me, inside me. A whisper curling through my thoughts like smoke. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a feeling, a pressure at the base of my skull. It wasn't asking, it wasn't pleading, it was telling. Come back. I clenched my jaw. I don't know how I did it, how I pushed back against whatever was clawing its way into my mind, but I did. Kessler, though, she was shaking violently. Her hands were clutching her head, her breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. "They're in me," she choked out. I can't." I grabbed her shoulders. "Listen to me. You have to fight it." She lifted her head, and my stomach dropped. Her pupils were gone. Her entire eye, both of them, had gone black. No light, no reflection, just endless, empty darkness. She inhaled sharply, her body stiffening. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in place. Then her lips parted, and a voice came out. Not hers, not human. Something else. "We were here before you." The tunnel trembled. The ice around us groaned, deep cracks splintering through it. The whisper in my head grew louder, turning into something more. Something alive. We never left. I backed away. The air was buzzing, a low vibration running through the ground, through my bones. And then, behind Carter and the others, I saw it. Rising from the tunnel's darkness. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even close. It was vast, its form shifting, moving in ways that broke every rule of nature. Limbs that weren't limbs. Faces that weren't faces. A presence so old, so massive, that my mind couldn't fully understand it. It hadn't just been sleeping. It had been watching, waiting, and we had brought it back. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I didn't even know if Kessler was behind me anymore. The tunnel was collapsing, ice breaking apart as the thing moved, stretching, expanding. The entire station above us was shaking. I could hear alarms blaring, warning signals echoing through the structure. I reached the end of the tunnel. The steel door was still there, still locked. I slammed my fist against the emergency override. The light blinked red, then green. The door hissed open. I stumbled through, gasping, feeling the first rush of fresh air. I turned back, just in time to see Kessler standing in the tunnel. Not running, just standing, watching me. Her mouth moved again. It's too late. Then, the door slammed shut. And I knew, deep in my gut, that it wasn't over, not even close. Because Antarctica hadn't just hidden something old, it had hidden something alive, and now it was free.